Nobody stops trucks. That's the whole point. You stop a truck, you stop money, and nobody in this city wants to stop money. That was the philosophy Carlos Trevino reportedly lived by, repeated in various forms to associates who later testified against him. A statement so plainly true about the economics of Laredo, Texas, that it barely registered as sinister when people first heard it. But buried inside that logic was something darker. A man who understood that an entire city's livelihood could be weaponized, that the same infrastructure feeding families on both sides of the Rio Grande could be hollowed out and repurposed as a pipeline for cocaine and heroin moving north into the American heartland. And so the question this story forces you to sit with is one that has no comfortable answer. How does a man look at a community's lifeline and see only a tool for his own ambition? And how long can a system designed to keep commerce flowing continue to function when someone is exploiting the very thing that makes it work? Laredo in the early 1990s was a city defined by motion. 18-wheelers lined up in staggering processions along Interstate 35, waiting to cross the international bridges that connected it to Nuevo Laredo, Mexico. The World Trade Bridge, the Columbia Solidarity Bridge, the gateway to the Americas. These crossings collectively processed more commercial truck traffic than any other port of entry in the United States. The numbers were difficult to comprehend. Thousands of trucks per day, hundreds of thousands per year, carrying auto parts, electronics, produce, textiles, and industrial materials in a ceaseless flow of legitimate trade that represented billions of dollars in economic activity. The North American Free Trade Agreement had supercharged this volume after 1994, and the city had built its identity around being the corridor through which Mexican manufacturing met American consumption. The heat was brutal, hovering above 100 degrees for months at a stretch, and the air smelled like diesel and asphalt and the faint mineral bite of the Rio Grande. The streets near the bridges were a permanent traffic jam of commerce. Customs officers worked in conditions that made thorough inspection nearly impossible. The ratio of trucks to inspectors was staggering, and everyone involved, from federal agents to city officials to the truckers themselves, understood that the system functioned on trust and volume, not on scrutiny. That gap between trust and scrutiny was exactly what Carlos Trevino needed. He was born and raised in Laredo, a local kid who grew up in a working-class neighborhood on the south side of the city where the culture was bilingual and the economy was defined by proximity to the border. People who knew him as a teenager described him as sharp, socially fluent, and unusually attuned to how money moved through the community. He was not a gangbanger in any conventional sense. He did not come up through street crews or prison affiliations. What he had was a merchant's instinct and a deep, almost scholarly understanding of the logistics that made Laredo function. He knew which trucking companies ran which routes. He knew the rhythm of customs enforcement, when shifts changed, when inspectors were overwhelmed, when secondary screening was most lax. By his mid-20s, he had begun assembling a network that straddled the border with a sophistication that local law enforcement initially failed to recognize as organized crime. His associates called him Los, a name that carried a quiet authority. He did not advertise himself. He did not flash wealth conspicuously. He drove reliable vehicles, lived in a modest home relative to his income, and conducted business with the demeanor of a man running a mid-sized import company, which, in a sense, he was. The operation Carlos built was predicated on hiding narcotics inside the legitimate commercial flow crossing the Laredo bridges. Cocaine and heroin originating from Gulf Cartel supply networks in Tamaulipas were concealed within shipments of goods that had valid customs documentation. The drugs were packed into hidden compartments in trailers carrying legal merchandise, produce, building materials, consumer goods, and the paperwork accompanying each load was genuine enough to pass routine inspection. Federal investigators would later estimate that the volume of narcotics moving through Trevino's network accounted for a significant percentage of all drug supply entering the country through the Texas border during his peak years of operation. The scale was staggering, but the method was deceptively simple. He exploited the fact that inspecting every truck was logistically impossible, and that the economic and political pressure to keep commerce moving made aggressive enforcement unpopular. He was not bribing his way across the bridge. He was hiding in plain sight inside a system that could not afford to slow down. The first major contradiction in Trevino's carefully maintained image surfaced in 1995, when a DEA informant embedded in Nuevo Laredo's smuggling networks identified a Laredo-based distributor who was receiving multi-kilogram cocaine shipments with a regularity that suggested direct cartel supply rather than freelance trafficking. The informant described a figure who operated with unusual discipline, no drug use, no conspicuous spending, no public affiliations with known traffickers. When agents cross-referenced the description with surveillance data from the bridges, they identified patterns in specific trucking routes that kept appearing at irregular but statistically significant intervals. Trucks associated with a small cluster of freight companies were crossing at times, and on days that did not align with their stated shipping schedules. When agents pulled the customs records, the paperwork was clean, but the schedules did not make business sense. That was the first crack. Why would a company shipping auto parts send a truck across the bridge at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday when its receiving warehouse did not open until 8? Trevino's response when associates raised concerns about increased enforcement activity was telling. Rather than scaling back, he expanded. He brought in additional trucking contacts and began rotating routes across multiple bridge crossings to dilute any single pattern. A wiretap authorized in late 1995 captured him speaking to a lieutenant in coded language that analysts initially struggled to decode, but one phrase recurred with notable frequency. He kept referencing the schedule, and when analysts mapped those references against bridge crossing data, the correlation was unmistakable. Specific mentions of the schedule, preceded by 48 hours the crossing of trucks that later proved to be carrying narcotics. He was coordinating shipments in near real time, and doing so with the confidence of a man who believed his communications were secure. The wiretap was the DEA's most significant intelligence breakthrough in the case, but it also revealed something about Trevino's psychology that investigators found chilling. He spoke about the drug shipments with the same flat, managerial tone he used to discuss legitimate business logistics. There was no excitement, no bravado. It was operational, and it was routine. That banality was, in its own way, more disturbing than any display of violence. The second major contradiction came when agents executed a controlled delivery in early 1996. Working with the informant, they allowed a shipment to cross the bridge and tracked it to a warehouse on Laredo's north side. When they raided the warehouse, they found 47 kilograms of cocaine and evidence of a distribution network that extended into San Antonio, Houston, and Dallas. Trevino was not present at the warehouse, and his name appeared on none of the seized documents. He had insulated himself with a discipline that frustrated investigators. But the warehouse operator, facing federal trafficking charges carrying a mandatory minimum of 20 years, made a decision that would eventually unravel everything. He agreed to cooperate, and what he told agents directly contradicted the story Trevino had constructed about himself. Trevino had always maintained, through intermediaries and in the rare moments he was questioned by local police, that he was a legitimate freight broker, a middleman connecting Mexican manufacturers with American retailers. The cooperating witness described a completely different operation. Trevino personally selected which trucks would carry narcotics, personally approved the timing of each crossing, and personally managed the proceeds through a network of cash businesses in Laredo that laundered drug money through what appeared to be ordinary commercial transactions. The freight broker story was not a cover for the drug operation. The drug operation was the primary enterprise, and the freight brokerage existed to serve it. The third contradiction was the most damaging and the most revealing of Trevino's character. When agents began interviewing his associates and business contacts, a pattern emerged that spoke to the depth of his deception. Several legitimate business owners in Laredo had entered into freight arrangements with Trevino's companies without any knowledge that their shipments were being used as cover for narcotics. Their trucks, their goods, their customs paperwork, all were being piggybacked by Trevino's network to create the appearance of routine commercial activity. When these business owners learned what had happened, several of them expressed a reaction that investigators found notable. They were not just angry, but genuinely bewildered. They described Trevino as professional, courteous, reliable, and meticulous in his business dealings. One told agents that Trevino had once personally driven 2 hours to resolve a paperwork discrepancy that was delaying a shipment, a level of customer service that seemed absurd in hindsight, given that his real concern was ensuring the customs documentation remained flawless for loads that contained hidden compartments packed with heroin. He had built his operation not on fear or violence, but on competence, and that competence had made him invisible in a city where thousands of people were engaged in the same kind of cross-border logistics work every single day. The investigation accelerated through 1996 and into 1997 as the cooperating witness introduced agents to additional members of Trevino's network. Each new cooperator added detail that tightened the evidentiary noose. Phone records corroborated the wiretap analysis. Financial records from the cash businesses showed deposits that could not be explained by their reported revenues. Surveillance footage from the bridges captured trucks identified by cooperators crossing at times consistent with the intercepted references to the schedule. And critically, the investigation began to map the supply chain backward across the border into Nuevo Laredo, where Trevino's sources were identified as operatives connected to the Gulf Cartel. This was the connection that transformed the case from a significant regional drug prosecution into something with national implications. For the first time in any federal court record, Laredo's street-level distribution network was being formally linked to Gulf Cartel supply operations. The DEA had long suspected such connections existed, but Trevino's case provided the documented evidence: wiretaps, financial records, cooperating witness testimony, and seized narcotics that established the link beyond dispute. As the investigation entered its final phase, Trevino's behavior shifted in ways that signaled he sensed the pressure closing in. He began liquidating some of his business interests, transferring assets, and reducing his visibility in the community. Associates later testified that he became unusually preoccupied with loyalty, questioning whether specific members of his organization could be trusted and expressing suspicion about individuals who had, in fact, he already begun cooperating with federal agents. He did not flee. Whether that decision reflected confidence that his insulation would hold, or a refusal to abandon the infrastructure he had spent years building, investigators could not say. But it made the arrest, when it came in early 1998, almost anticlimactic. Federal agents took him into custody at a gas station on the outskirts of Laredo without incident. He was polite, composed, and said nothing of substance. Even in handcuffs, he projected the calm of a man who had spent his entire adult life managing risk. The trial laid bare the scope of what Trevino had built. Prosecutors presented evidence that his organization had moved hundreds of kilograms of cocaine and significant quantities of heroin across the Laredo bridges over the better part of a decade. Multiple cooperating witnesses testified to his direct, hands-on management of the operation. The wiretap recordings were played for the jury, and the flat, dull-sigh business-like quality of his voice discussing drug shipments made a visible impression on jurors who had perhaps expected something more dramatic. His defense team argued that the cooperating witnesses were unreliable, that their testimony was motivated by the desire to reduce their own sentences, and that the wiretap evidence was ambiguous. But the volume of corroborating evidence, the financial records, the customs data, the surveillance footage, the seized narcotics, made the defense's task effectively impossible. Carlos Trevino was convicted on multiple federal drug trafficking and conspiracy charges. He was sentenced to a substantial term in federal prison. The aftermath of the case rippled outward in ways that reshaped both Laredo and the federal government's approach to the border. The DEA was forced to fundamentally revise its assessment of the Laredo crossing's vulnerability, acknowledging that the sheer volume of legitimate commercial traffic created security gaps that organized traffickers had been exploiting far more effectively than previously understood. New inspection protocols, additional staffing, and enhanced coordination between customs and drug enforcement agencies were implemented in the years following the prosecution. Several of Trevino's associates received their own federal sentences. The legitimate business owners whose freight operations had been unknowingly co-opted spent years dealing with the legal and financial fallout of their association with his companies. And the community of Laredo itself was left to reckon with an uncomfortable truth, that the same economic engine that sustained the city, the bridges, the trucks, the flow of trade, had been turned against it by a man who understood its mechanics better than almost anyone. What Carlos Trevino's story ultimately reveals is not just the ingenuity of a single criminal mind, but the fragility of systems that depend on volume and trust. He did not corrupt officials. He did not wage wars in the streets. He did not leave a trail of bodies. He simply looked at the busiest commercial border crossing in the United States and recognized that its greatest strength, the unstoppable flow of legitimate commerce, was also its most exploitable weakness. And he bet, correctly for nearly a decade, that no one would slow that flow down long enough to find what he had hidden inside it. The moral question this story opened with has no resolution that feels clean. A man saw a system, understood it completely, and used that understanding to cause immeasurable harm, not through violence, but through patience, competence, and the quiet exploitation of a community's trust. The trucks still cross the bridges in Laredo, thousands of them, every day. The commerce continues. And somewhere in the space between what is inspected and what is not, though the question Carlos Trevino answered for himself remains open for everyone else. What are you willing to hide inside the things that keep a city alive?